Walk into any antique shop or historical museum and you'll find them. Ornate cast iron stoves from the 19th century, beautiful pieces of metalwork that we're told were simple wood-burning heaters. But look closer. Really look at these devices, not with the eyes of a casual observer, but with the mind of an engineer. What you'll discover will shake everything you thought you knew about the technologies of the past and the true capabilities of our ancestors. These aren't just heating stoves. They're artifacts of a forgotten energy revolution, evidence of a technology so powerful and so dangerous to the existing power structure that it had to be systematically erased from history and replaced with a comforting lie about burning logs and shoveling coal. The first thing that strikes you about these antique heating units is the sheer quality of their construction. These are not crude functional objects hastily assembled to keep a room warm. They are masterpieces of artistic casting, displaying a level of craftsmanship and attention to detail that speaks to an extraordinarily sophisticated manufacturing culture. The decorative elements, the precision of the metalwork, the complexity of the mechanical components. If someone today wanted to replicate these devices to the same standard, they would face enormous challenges. Our modern production methods, for all their supposed advancement, often fall short when compared to these backwards technologies from over a century ago. But set aside the aesthetics for a moment. Approach these stoves from a purely engineering standpoint, and something deeply troubling emerges. The design of these units contradicts everything we know about burning solid fuel. The physics simply doesn't add up. Look at the combustion chambers. In countless models, the fuel doors are absurdly small, miniature openings that couldn't possibly accommodate a standard-sized log. You'd have to break wood down into chips, into tiny fragments, just to feed these stoves. And here's where the official story starts to crumble. To heat a large room, let alone the spacious halls of 19th century mansions, with their high ceilings and vast volumes of air, you would need to burn enormous quantities of wood. But with such tiny fireboxes, you'd be standing beside the stove every few minutes, constantly adding fuel, around the clock, day and night. It's completely irrational. No one would design a heating system that requires continuous manual operation. Even more puzzling is what these stoves are missing. The combustion process requires two things: oxygen supply and ash removal. Yet many of these antique units have no ash pans, no blowers, no obvious system for dealing with the residue that any solid fuel inevitably produces. Where was the ash supposed to go? Did the fuel somehow burn without leaving any trace? And then there's the smoke extraction problem. On some models, pipe connections appear in the strangest locations. At the bottom, on the sides, in jar, places that make no sense for venting combustion gases. On others, there are no pipe connections at all, just decorative grills. Try using a wood-burning stove without proper ventilation in a closed room, and you'll quickly understand why this is insane. You'd be dead from carbon monoxide poisoning within hours. But perhaps the most intriguing features are the complex mechanical regulators found on these devices. Handles, rotating mechanisms, adjustment knobs positioned on doors, at the base, on the top lid. For a simple damper controlling airflow to a fire, this level of complexity is absurd. It's overkill to an extreme degree. These controls suggest something far more sophisticated, some process that required precise tuning and careful adjustment. Not the crude on-off mechanics of feeding a fire, but the fine control of a fundamentally different energy source. Some examples are small enough to be portable, designed to be moved from room to room, or even used in tents and carriages. At that scale, burning solid fuel becomes meaningless. A handful of coals wouldn't provide heat for more than 30 minutes. Yet these compact units were clearly meant to operate for extended periods. Everything about these stoves suggests they were designed for an entirely different principle of operation. They were never meant to burn wood or coal. The pipes you see on museum exhibits today, the crude modifications, the welded-on chimneys, these are later adaptations. Desperate improvisations by people who inherited high-tech devices but lost access to the original fuel source. People who were forced to drill holes and retrofit advanced equipment to work with primitive organic combustion. The original design implied something else entirely, a compact, powerful, clean energy source that could simply be inserted into the unit and would provide steady heat without smoke, without ash, without any of the mess and inefficiency of burning materials. And the proof of this? It's not hidden in lost documents or secret archives. It's cast directly into the metal of the stoves themselves, visible to anyone who knows what to look for. The answer is literally written on these devices, stamped into the cast iron, molded into the doors and side panels, clear as day for anyone willing to see it. On countless surviving examples, you'll find a single word, radium, and sometimes, even more telling, the universal symbol for radiation. Those characteristic triangular warning signs, the stylized rays emanating from a central point. To a modern person, finding these markings on a household heating appliance from the 19th century seems impossible, unthinkable. We've been conditioned to associate radiation with death, with invisible poison, with the horrors of Chernobyl and Fukushima. But it's precisely this detail that explains everything, that transforms all those engineering absurdities into a coherent, logical system. If these stoves were designed not as chambers for burning wood, but as housings for high-tech fuel elements based on radium or similar radioactive materials, then suddenly it all makes sense. The tiny combustion chambers become justified. You don't need much space to house a compact energy capsule. The absence of ash pans and oxygen supply systems makes perfect sense, because radioactive decay doesn't require air and doesn't produce mountains of ash. The heat is generated by the material itself, warming the massive cast iron body, which then radiates powerful, consistent warmth throughout the room. No smoke, no soot, no constant maintenance. Just steady, reliable heat from a source that could operate for months, possibly years, without any intervention. This hypothesis solves one of the greatest mysteries of historical architecture. Anyone who has visited old castles, palaces, or cathedrals in winter knows the problem. These enormous stone structures with ceilings several stories high are brutally cold. Traditional fireplaces are catastrophically inefficient in such spaces. Most of the heat disappears up the chimney along with the smoke. The strong draft creates constant air movement, pulling heated air outside. You can stand directly in front of a roaring fire and still freeze. Heating a suite of interconnected rooms through an entire winter would require destroying forests on an industrial scale and employing an army of servants working around the clock. But if autonomous radium heaters were used, everything changes. One properly charged cast iron unit could maintain stable temperatures for extended periods without any attention. The pipes sometimes found on these designs weren't for smoke extraction. They were for venting specific decay products or for circulating heated air through convection systems. This is how comfort was maintained in the grand residences of the past. Buildings that today stand as cold, empty monuments, requiring modern heating systems to be remotely inhabitable. There's documentary evidence supporting this theory that official history dismisses as fantasy. French postcards from the 1910s explicitly depict domestic scenes with captions reading, "Heating with radium." We're told these were naive dreams inspired by the recent discovery of radioactivity, artists imagining a utopian future. But what if they weren't visions of tomorrow? What if they were snapshots of actual life, advertisements for a technology that genuinely existed and was in common use? The story of how these stoves ended up being converted supports this theory. When the supply of factory-made fuel elements ran out, when the technology for producing them was lost or deliberately suppressed, the owners of these sophisticated devices had no choice. They had to adapt them for whatever fuel was available. Wood and coal became the desperate substitutes. People cut holes in beautiful cast iron casings, welded on makeshift chimneys, and resigned themselves to terrible efficiency, transforming precision engineering into crude potbelly stoves. The radiation symbol on the door wasn't a warning in the modern sense. It was a fuel-type indicator, like the diesel label on an engine. It told you what energy source the device was designed to use. And here's the crucial question. If these compact sources of enormous energy were widely used in homes to provide heat, why would industry and transport ignore such an opportunity? The need for powerful, autonomous energy sources has always been most acute in transportation. Which brings us to the railways and to contradictions in the official history that are even more glaring than those found on antique stoves. If radium-based energy elements were practical for domestic heating, it would be absurd to think they weren't used in locomotives and industrial applications. And when you examine the history of 19th century railway development with this possibility in mind, the official version starts to disintegrate completely. Consider the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. According to archival records, nearly 10,000 kilometers of continuous track were laid in just 13 and a half years, from 1891 to 1904, through taiga, through swamps, through permafrost and solid rock, an average construction rate of 40 kilometers per year. And we're told this was accomplished using primitive manual labor: shovels, pickaxes, wheelbarrows, no modern road-building machinery. Such speed seems fantastic even today with powerful excavators, laser surveying equipment, and industrial explosives. For that era, it's only possible under two scenarios. Either the builders possessed technologies far superior to ours, or they weren't building the railway from scratch, but excavating and restoring tracks from an ancient global network that already existed. But even more questions arise from the locomotives themselves. Study the design of a classic steam engine from that period, and you're struck by its complexity. This is not a stove on wheels. It's an intricate thermodynamic machine, a tangle of thousands of tubes, valves, pressure gauges, and regulators. The internal structure of a steam locomotive bears a remarkable resemblance to the operating principles of a power plant on a modern nuclear submarine. The concept is identical. A heat source boils water, creating high-pressure steam that performs mechanical work. The only difference, we're told, is the heat source. In a submarine, it's a nuclear reactor with fissionable uranium. In a steam locomotive, supposedly, it's burning wood or coal. And here's the fundamental contradiction. Why would engineers capable of creating such sophisticated machinery tolerate such a primitive fuel supply system? Look at how coal was stored at railway stations. Huge piles in the open air, exposed to rain and snow. Wet coal loses its heating value. It begins to decay, to spontaneously combust. These smoldering heaps can't be extinguished with water. They just burn until they're gone. Wood is even worse. Exposed to weather, it rots and becomes waterlogged, nearly useless for generating steam. Did the brilliant designers who created these perfect machines somehow forget to build basic shelters for the fuel? Or is the answer simpler and more disturbing? These locomotives were never designed to burn coal or wood at all. This theory is supported by how water was treated. Unlike the coal storage, water towers from that era are architectural masterpieces. They were constructed with high-quality brick, decorated with elaborate ornamental elements, built with enormous investment in aesthetics and durability. These water temples still stand today, monuments to their own importance. This reverent treatment of water, combined with complete disregard for coal protection, suggests something crucial. Water was the primary working fluid. Coal was a later, forced, and extremely inefficient substitute for the true heat source. Most likely, locomotives originally carried that hypothetical element in their fireboxes, a cartridge containing radium or another active substance. It provided stable, powerful heating of water without smoke, without ash, without the need to drag a tender car loaded with tons of dirty fuel. This explains the complexity of locomotive design, the cleanliness of train stations visible in old photographs, and the lack of developed coal infrastructure in the early railway period. When the supply of high-tech elements was exhausted, when the production technology was lost, humanity had to convert these sophisticated machines to forage. We started burning forests and coal deposits in them, accepting a catastrophic drop in efficiency. The technology existed. The infrastructure functioned flawlessly, but at some point, the system broke down, and the perpetual motion machine had to be fed with logs. To understand where this mysterious energy source disappeared and why the word radium today is associated exclusively with danger, we need to examine the official story of its discovery. And here, when you dive into the biographies of the famous discoverers, the narrative begins to look less like scientific history and more like a poorly constructed cover-up operation. We're taught a touching story about Pierre and Marie Curie, poor enthusiasts working in a leaky shed with a dirt floor. According to this legend, they processed ore with their bare hands in simple basins, driven purely by scientific curiosity, and ultimately, at the cost of their own health, gave the world a new element. But compare this romantic myth to the actual figures of production reports and financial documentation from that period, and the official version collapses entirely. Let's look at the physics and logistics. To obtain just 1 gram of pure radium requires processing colossal volumes of raw material. The technological chain demands hundreds of tons of water, 5 train cars of various chemical reagents, 100 cars of coal to maintain temperature regimes, and most critically, dozens of tons of uranium pitchblende ore. To imagine that 2 people, even geniuses, could organize and conduct such a process in the artisanal conditions of a shed is physically impossible. This is industrial-scale production requiring massive financial backing and complex supply chains. Here, the true sponsors enter the picture, names that usually remain in the shadows. The uranium ore for the Curie experiments was provided by the Austrian government through the Academy of Sciences. But that was only part of the necessary resources. The main financier who paid for the remaining 10 tons of ore and related expenses was Baron Edmund de Rothschild. The participation of such a figure, a representative of one of the wealthiest and most influential families on the planet, completely transforms the story. Bankers at the Rothschild level never invest in abstract scientific fantasies without guaranteed returns. Most likely, the Baron knew exactly what needed to be found. One gets the impression that the Curie's task wasn't to discover something new, but to recreate lost technology, to reproduce the fuel source of a previous civilization, the substance that powered those eternal stoves and locomotives. The elites were trying to regain control over an energy source they had lost. Even stranger is the biological aspect of this story, which contradicts everything we're taught about radiation sickness. We're told the discoverers paid with their lives for their experiments, but the facts suggest otherwise. Pierre Curie didn't die from radiation at all. His life ended tragically and suspiciously under the wheels of a horse-drawn carriage, just years after receiving the Nobel Prize. Was this an accident? Or was it a way to eliminate someone who had learned too much about the real properties of what they were extracting? Marie Curie worked for decades with radium, polonium, and uranium without any protection. She carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes in her pockets, kept them at her bedside like nightlights. By modern standards, she should have died within months. Instead, she lived to age 60, respectable lifespan for that era. Moreover, 2 years after her husband's death, while continuing intensive work with radioactive substances, she began a passionate affair with a young officer. This hardly suggests a body ravaged by radiation poisoning. The radiation, it seems, didn't kill her. It may have actually stimulated her vitality. The most compelling evidence that we don't understand the true nature of historical radium comes from Marie's children. Her second daughter, Eve, was born during the period when her mother was working closely with concentrated radioactive materials. According to modern medical understanding, the child should have suffered serious genetic damage. But Eve Curie was not only born healthy, she lived an incredibly long and full life, dying at age 102. She was beautiful, talented, energetic, outliving nearly all her contemporaries. Her older sister, Irene, also worked with radiation and lived a decent lifespan. A paradoxical situation emerges. On one hand, 1 gram of radium cost more than 200 kilograms of gold, and its extraction was financed by the world's richest families. On the other hand, people at the epicenter of radiation exposure demonstrated remarkable longevity and health. This suggests the substance they were extracting wasn't a deadly poison, but a powerful energy source, and possibly a biological stimulant. But if this is true, why was a global information campaign subsequently launched, turning the word radiation into a synonym for inevitable death? And how do we explain that despite costs exceeding gold by hundreds of times, products containing radium suddenly flooded pharmacies and stores worldwide, becoming available to ordinary consumers? Here lies another grand deception. Looking at humanity's commercial interaction with radium reveals an economic paradox so glaring it destroys the official narrative by itself. Remember the facts. Extracting radium was incredibly complex and expensive. The market value of 1 gram at the turn of the 20th century equaled over 200 kilograms of pure gold. It was the most expensive material on the planet, accessible only to select financial elites and government institutions. Yet at the exact same time, store shelves and pharmacies were flooded with consumer products branded with the radium label, toothpaste with radium for whiter teeth, radioactive powder for glowing skin, chocolate with radium for vitality, water enriched with radium emanations as a cure for all ailments, special household devices called revigators that supposedly saturated drinking water with healing energy. Here's the elementary arithmetic problem that has no solution within official history. How could a substance costing a fortune per gram end up in a tube of toothpaste selling for pocket change? If manufacturers actually added pure radium, the price would exceed the budget of a small town. If they added microscopic homeopathic doses, there could be no physical effect worth advertising. Only two logical explanations exist. First option, it was a massive marketing scam, comparable to modern nanotechnology cosmetics. Enterprising dealers, capitalizing on the hype around the new discovery, sold fakery to the gullible public. Instead of precious radium, they added cheap phosphorescent compounds or low-cost thorium salts to create an appearance of science. People paid for a brand name without receiving benefit or harm beyond empty wallets. The second option is far more sinister and implies a deliberate long-term strategy to discredit the energy source. Perhaps the elites, recognizing the potential of radium technologies, those eternal stoves and engines, decided to hide them from the masses. But you couldn't simply ban what every newspaper was celebrating. So, an operation was launched to desacralize and ultimately demonize the substance. First, radium was turned into a joke, a household novelty, reducing a profound technology to the level of snake oil and face cream. Then, once the market was saturated with dubious products, the pendulum swung hard in the opposite direction. An information campaign began, built on real or fabricated tragedies. The story of the Radium Girls, factory workers who painted watch dials and developed horrific illnesses, was amplified with maximum publicity. Suddenly, the life-giving ray became an invisible killer. This enabled strict government regulation, confiscation of all independent radioactive materials, and monopolization of the entire field under the pretext of public safety. The psychological conditioning was brilliant. The average person developed an automatic fear response. The word radiation became synonymous with agonizing death. Fear paralyzed any desire by independent researchers to explore this direction. Who in their right mind would experiment in their garage with something universally believed to kill everything living? Thus, humanity voluntarily abandoned the search for autonomous energy sources, returning to burning hydrocarbons and becoming dependent on centralized fuel supplies controlled by those in power. But is radiation really as uniformly deadly as we've been taught? Does all ionizing radiation bring only destruction of biological tissue? Observations from nature and certain historical paradoxes force us to question this dogma. There are facts that science prefers to ignore because they contradict the created worldview where radiation equals absolute evil. Perhaps we've simply forgotten how to distinguish between two fundamentally different types of the same phenomenon. The modern understanding of radiation is unequivocal. It's invisible death, destroying DNA, causing mutations and incurable diseases. The Geiger counter crackling an alarm has become a harbinger of apocalypse. But if we set aside the fears programmed into our subconscious and examine objective reality, observations of living nature, and facts that science shamefully ignores, a completely different picture emerges. Everything points to the existence of two fundamentally different types of radiation. Primitive instruments record them identically, but their impact on biological organisms is diametrically opposite. The first type is indeed destructive, combat radiation, the result of violent nuclear fission, a dirty byproduct of weapons technology and catastrophes. But there's a second type, natural or technologically ordered radiation, which, by all indications, is not an enemy, but a powerful catalyst for life processes and an ideal heat source. The best proving ground for this theory has become the Chernobyl exclusion zone. According to expert forecasts made immediately after the accident, this territory was supposed to become a scorched radioactive desert, where life would be impossible for centuries. Scientists predicted terrible mutations and dead forests. The reality, 3 decades later, has shocked the scientific world, though they try not to publicize it. The exclusion zone has transformed into one of the richest and most thriving nature reserves on the continent. Where dosimeters scream their warnings, a genuine biological explosion is underway. Populations of wolves, elk, deer, and wild boar haven't just recovered. They exceed numbers in clean forests by many times. Rare species have returned, the black stork, Przewalski's horse. The animals appear healthy, active, producing numerous and vigorous offspring without signs of genetic deformities. Vegetation reclaims abandoned cities with incredible speed. Trees grow faster and more powerfully, It creates the impression that elevated radiation acts on the biosphere as an elixir of life, accelerating metabolism and enhancing regeneration once the main destructive factor, humans, is removed. A similar phenomenon destroying official dogma appears in Japan. The Hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, should have withered in agony according to linear, no-threshold radiation models. Statistics show the opposite. Among this group, an anomalously high percentage of centenarians is observed. Their children and grandchildren were born healthy, contrary to all geneticists' dire predictions. This forces us to conclude that brief exposure to a powerful energy flow, if it doesn't kill instantly through thermal shock, can trigger hidden recovery reserves in the organism. All of this leads to a single thought. The technologies of the past, those stoves and heaters marked with radium symbols, used precisely this beneficial spectrum of radiation. Engineers of that era knew how to extract pure thermal energy from substances that were safe for humans. It was soft, warming heat similar to sunlight, which is also, fundamentally, radiation. Those radioactive waters and cosmetics from the turn of the century may have genuinely worked and healed when the technology was properly applied. The advertising didn't lie. It described real effects that we've since lost. We found remnants of this knowledge but failed to distinguish creative energy from destructive energy. We lumped everything together under a danger sign and banned it all. The idea that humanity used cheap, safe decay energy for centuries before being forcibly switched to dependence on hydrocarbons explains countless historical oddities. Moreover, this technology likely wasn't invented in the 19th century. Cast iron stoves and steam locomotives represent the sunset, the final echoes of a great civilization that possessed these secrets to perfection. If we look deeper into history, we find that traces of radiant heating lead us to antiquity. There, among the ruins of ancient Rome, we discover exactly the same engineering impossibilities we saw in Victorian mansions. The connection across time is far stronger than commonly believed, and the threads of lost technology stretch from the 19th centuries deep into the ancient world. Examine the engineering solutions of ancient Rome closely, and you'll find a mirror reflection of the same contradictions found in cast iron stoves. Official historical science offers us the term hypocaust, an underfloor heating system that supposedly warmed luxurious villas and public baths. We're told that beneath the floors were vast hollow spaces supported by columns where hot air circulated from fires that slaves tended around the clock in furnaces outside the buildings. But anyone familiar with wood-burning stoves or solid fuel boilers will immediately spot fatal flaws in this theory. Burning wood inevitably produces enormous amounts of soot, tar, and creosote. These combustion products coat chimney walls, requiring regular, laborious cleaning. If neglected, the passage narrows, draft disappears, and most dangerously, accumulated soot can ignite, creating temperatures capable of destroying stone. Imagine the process of cleaning a labyrinth of low underground channels less than a meter high. How could slaves crawl into these narrow, soot-choked catacombs to remove layers of buildup accumulated over years? It's technically impossible. But the most damning argument against the wood-burning theory comes from the ruins themselves. During excavations of Roman baths and villas, archaeologists uncover those underground spaces. And what do they find? The brick and stone inside these channels are pristine, not a centimeter of carbon deposits, no traces of thermal destruction, no ingrained soot that should have inevitably penetrated the porous materials over centuries of operation. These surfaces look freshly constructed. They've never seen open flame. This is physical proof that the heat source was fundamentally different. The Romans, like 19th century engineers, used clean energy. The pillars beneath the floors served not as smoke channels, but as thermal mass elements, or housings for placement of those same active elements we discussed earlier. The energy source was positioned in the underground space, heated the stone mass, and the warm floor radiated soft, uniform heat into rooms above, without smoke, without carbon monoxide, without the need to deforest surrounding countryside or maintain armies of stokers. It was technology providing autonomous comfort for decades with a single loading. A complete picture of global technological regression emerges. We live on the ruins of a civilization that possessed the secret of obtaining cheap, perhaps even free, energy. Whether Roman villas or St. Petersburg apartment buildings of the 19th century, the principle was identical. Structures were designed for autonomous heat sources requiring no connection to utility networks. Enormous windows, high ceilings, absence of entrance vestibules in old buildings, all calculated for powerful and constant heat flow that didn't need to be conserved. Then a certain global failure occurred, a catastrophe, a reorganization of the world. As a result, the key element of the technology, the fuel itself, was confiscated, banned, or lost. Magnificent engineering systems became useless decoration. The inheritors of this great era had to adapt to harsh new reality, punching holes through walls for chimneys, installing ugly pipes, filling sophisticated underground systems with earth, and converting to primitive organic combustion. The saddest aspect is economic. The transition from autonomous, eternal sources to combustible fuel marked the beginning of the era of energy slavery. You cannot put a meter on radioactive decay or etheric capacitor operation, but it's very easy to sell people coal, wood, gas, and electricity, forcing them to pay for every kilowatt of heat. Perhaps that's precisely why radium technologies were so carefully discredited and then erased from memory, replaced with fairy tales about fires under floors and primitive stoves. In conclusion, one thing deserves emphasis. The world around us is full of silent witnesses to a different past. They stand on city streets, in museums, at train stations, in old estates. Official history tries to cover them with a veil of familiar explanations, but that fabric tears at the slightest application of logic. It's enough to stop taking textbook narratives on faith and start examining things with your own eyes, asking inconvenient engineering questions. Details we're trained not to notice. The cleanliness of ancient brickwork, the absence of chimneys, the strange symbols on doors, these are capable of destroying false worldviews and opening doors to understanding who we really were and what was taken from us. The truth isn't hidden behind 7 seals. It lies directly in front of us, cast into iron and stone, waiting for someone brave enough to see it.